Hey everyone, I'm Max Notice, and welcome back to the Recruitment Automation Podcast. RAP is a weekly podcast brought to you by Wade and Wendy, your on-demand AI recruitment platform. The Recruitment Automation Podcast focuses on the world's most innovative, efficient, and forward-thinking recruitment processes. We're joined today by Ivan H. Lee, who has led diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at both Apple and T-Mobile. So Ivan, great to have you here. So would you mind starting off by telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've done?
Sure, yeah. So I've built out various programs at Apple and now at T-Mobile. And so, for example, in the past, I've really helped to build out the employee resource groups at Apple and also connecting those efforts as a recruiting tool to the external talent pipeline. And, as I've been thinking about what's been going on recently, I'm especially encouraged by the steps that Fortune 500 companies are recently taking to address internal diversity concerns. I think a lot of organizations, whether out of their own volition or they've been kind of forced to do so by their employee population, they've really been taking a deeper look at not only their customer brand but also their employer brand. So I'm really encouraged by what's happening recently.
Yeah, there's definitely more of a focus on these issues than ever before. But you mentioned something about recruiting, which brings me to the next point I was actually going to bring up from our last conversation. You believe that retention is a much better measure of the inclusiveness of an organization than those of hiring numbers. And you even said, and I quote, if a company really cares about diversity, they must create a retention program. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Why is retention so important to diversity?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's quite simple that retention efforts really come first. Why waste efforts on hiring talent that walk out the door a year later or even sooner? If you think about it, in order to improve a company's demographic makeup, you really need to investigate the policies and practices for the entire employee life cycle, especially when it comes to promotions. And in order to do that, you have to dive into available data, and if it's not available, you have to make it available and find it. You have to ask the hard questions. For example, why were the last 10 VP level promotions all of one demographic when there were clearly diverse candidates at the director level positions to fill those spots? So as companies look into this, they may find a lot of things that maybe they turn a blind eye to and they just didn't want to know, or maybe they decide, we do want to change that now. And I think for a lot of organizations who want to dive into this, you got to have the leaders, the C-suite, in partnership with HR and HR analytics. Together, they should be investigating these metrics.
Interesting. Another interesting point you mentioned was it's so much less expensive and more impactful to focus on retention than it is to acquire new talent from diverse backgrounds. Just an interesting thing.
Yeah, if you think about it, they're already there, so they're going to be your biggest advocates, or maybe not.
Yeah, or even to the point, well, you can bring diverse candidates in, but are they comfortable at your organization? Are they growing? Mm-hmm. That's really a sign. I think it's such a more sincere litmus test.
Yep, absolutely.
Going along with that, when we were catching up before, you also mentioned that referrals can be really the ultimate double-edged sword when it comes to recruiting diverse candidates. Talk to me about how referrals can help or hinder an organization's diversity efforts.
Yeah, so if you think about it, first-person accounts from employees, word of mouth, it's still the best way for prospective candidates to gain insight into a company. And with the advent of things like Glassdoor and Blind and even Reddit to some extent, employee opinions are now commoditized. They're widely available. So if your current employee and your current employee base, they're speaking openly about the lack of diversity, about other employee concerns, that could deter diverse candidates from even applying.
Yeah, I've even heard of some companies going as far as they make it impossible on the ATS to see whether this candidate is a referral or not. So they're not getting necessarily that nepotism or just continuing the same problem that's existing in a company and exacerbating it. Yeah,
it's a double-edged sword, right? It's sometimes employee referrals are helpful. But if, let's say, the existing efforts are not working at our organization, then maybe you're right. Maybe one of the mechanisms, one of the tactics is to de-emphasize internal referrals. That could be one tactic used.
It's a good point. Now, so another thing that I noticed is really impressive in your background is that you have a history of helping companies to bring up difficult subjects and really ask tough to engage with types of questions. So what are good ways for companies to foster a culture of open dialogue and bring up questions that have historically been too uncomfortable to ask? How do you start building an inclusive culture from scratch?
I think the willingness and the initiative should come from the top. Leaders typically, they set the tone for the organization, and if you think about how most organizations, big companies are run, the model still is based off of the military, right? If you think about the rank and file, the org structure, it's based off of the military, and it seems to be still the most effective model for big companies, right? Maybe if your company has 500 people or less than 1,000, you can have a more distributed leadership model, but it's not the case when you have hundreds of thousands of employees. And so that's why I still think that for these kind of major change management efforts, you need a project management office, you need an office of organizational development that reports directly to the C-suite to help initiate some of these changes. And then, of course, once the effort is initiated, it has to be continued systematically. So here's an example. These topics and these conversations, you can just start having them by, say, inviting a guest speaker into your monthly town hall meeting, or having panel discussions on these topics. And then once you start having those conversations at a company-wide level, hosting these town halls and hosting these, broadcasting your panel discussions, you can you can create a committee that includes frontline staff, includes line level managers, so people from all across the organization, to continue the conversation and also to hold the senior leaders accountable for continuing what they started. So it's not just like a one-time thing, flavor of the month kind of thing, that they can help to make sure that it's sustained through a longer period of time.
It makes a ton of sense. And it's interesting because we hear it time and time again that it has to start at the top. But if it doesn't start at the top, if that's not an issue and it's just the lower bottom that's making this an issue, then to the top, this is a distraction. You're putting your effort in somewhere that isn't important. And if isn't important for an organization, that's fortunately not a good look anymore. Yeah. So,
yeah.
So kind of going along with that, actually. So again, we hear all the time that it starts at the top, but what are things that anybody can do in their position to change their circle or their organization to open up that dialogue?
Most employee resource groups, ERGs, they are started organically. And so it starts with employees maybe at director and below level positions. They speak up and they act up. And so with collaboration tools like Slack and Teams, I think it's easy for any of us to rally the troops in your organization to speak up about certain issues, and to create the opportunities and to create a new community, overnight like that. And I think so anybody can do so using the internal tools. But as these organic efforts evolve, they're going to require other support structures. At an advanced stage, I would recommend that people find executive sponsors who kind of know the politics and the inner workings of an organization, who can help guide you and to guide these groups in institutionalizing efforts. So often it's a combination of individual employees speaking up in conjunction with having basically, think about like a petition, right, that's signed by X number of employees, plus management support, plus some maybe some board pressure saying, hey, what are you doing in this regard? It's typically a combination of efforts that institutionalizes um, the programs, the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at our organization. So some come from the top, some come from the side, some come from suppliers and customers, and a lot comes from the employees. So it's a concerted effort.
That is interesting. So it can really start at the bottom too, but having that meet in the middle, almost having that sponsorship really drives it a long way.
Yeah, it's like it takes just one person to start it, but it takes some people at the top to institutionalize it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I guess that collaboration is what kind of unifies it across the org.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, well put. All right, then, Ivan, we've got one more question for you here today.
Sure.
So we obviously think a lot about technology and how it's impacting the hiring process. So when it comes to diversity inclusion initiatives, do you see any places where technology can have an impact? Have you seen any specific tools or practices that are making a difference today? And if so, like, what other opportunities do you see for automation and technology in helping to create more diverse candidates, more diverse companies, and helping to eliminate just that unconscious bias?
I think LinkedIn has been one of the best tools to improve the hiring of diverse candidates. The platform allows them to shine, basically, and in ways that maybe other platforms or even systems like an ATS just doesn't allow them to shine. And I think an opportunity that's still missing in the employee life cycle is actually, I think it goes back to the education gap. If you think about the employee life cycle, it goes back to the candidate experience, and it goes back to the talent pipeline of the educated workforce. And so the education gap is probably the biggest gap right now, especially for people of color. There continues to be barriers in the graduation rate for people of color, and maybe technology and advances in education financing can help with that. So I think that's where a lot of the technology can have an impact there. And in the meantime, a lot of Fortune 500 companies are recognizing this, and so they're just completely sidestepping that gap by removing college degree requirements altogether. So a lot of major tech companies, right? If you can do the job, why does it matter that you have this piece of paper? And so I think there's a lot that can be done to help with the education financing issue that disproportionately impacts people of color.
I mean, that boils down to beyond how an organization's handling something. That boils down to the systematic nature of a lot of these injustices to begin with.
That's right. It's all part of the life cycle, and I know a lot of organizations are doing what they can to improve the pipeline. So, for example, a lot of organizations have more diverse interns. They have a internship program that focuses on historically Black colleges, and so with these kind of internship programs, they are building that pipeline such that they're supporting the people who are in the educational process so that they improve their graduation rates, and giving them the experience they need to succeed in the industry. A lot of the interns, they don't necessarily come back to the companies of the internet, but that experience led them to improve their overall viability in the industry and in the workforce, which improves the industry pipeline as a whole. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of help me, help you, help each other kind of things. It's a very collaborative environment.
That's really impressive. It's an excellent point, because I mean, listen, a college degree costs thousands and thousands of dollars. An internship may not necessarily, and having a strong internship where you really learn something, you can prove that, may actually give you a better conversation moving into the workforce than did you enjoy your time at whatever university. What does that matter at the end of the day? Well, excellent point, Ivan. All right, so Ivan, that's really all we have for you lined up here today. Thank you again so much for stopping by the show and sharing your words and wisdom with us. So before we click off, do you have any last things, any shout outs, anything you want to relay or share with the audience?
Not today. I just wanted to encourage everyone to continue these efforts. So we're in this for the long run, and to always to take care of yourself, practice self-care to sustain these efforts on the long run. And thank you for having me today, Max. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Ivan. Please come back anytime. All right. So thanks so much again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, until next time.